Okay, so for our next presentation, as we said earlier, this is the third time we've run our annual Sport and Fitness conference, and we've noticed over the years that we've had quite a few of our own students and students from other institutions come along to the conference and have found it a really positive experience. So we thought it'd be a really nice idea this year if we could have an invited PhD keynote speaker. So our speaker today is someone who comes to this from a very unique perspective. So not only is she a PhD researcher and she's got the academic side and she's doing the research into this area, she also has the experience of being a high-level athlete herself. She's an Olympian. She competed in the 4x4 at the Olympics. She's a 400-metre hurdler, which I am also, but I would be very much behind her in a race. So I'm delighted to introduce from the University of Limerick, Jessie Barr.
Thanks, Caroline. Sorry, I have a tendency to get cotton mouth, so definitely need water before I start. So thank you so much, first of all, to the Open University for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity that Caroline and Karen have given me to be able to present my research today. What I'm going to be looking at today is this idea, and it's something that Helen mentioned a lot, and you really set up. It's like if we had sat down and planned you going first, we couldn't have planned it any better, because a lot of what you spoke about is actually what I'm going to be speaking about myself. So this idea of stigma comes up again and again every time you talk about mental health. And so I'm going to talk about today from an Irish context. So I don't know if there's any Irish people here, but we are in a little bit on the back foot when it comes to mental health research, mental health support, unfortunately. So just to give you my own background, this research has had to go on the back foot, has kind of pressed pause on it a little bit, because I got an amazing opportunity to work as a trainee sports psychologist at the Irish Institute of Sport, or Sport Ireland Institute it's now called. So my PhD has kind of gone on the back foot. I've taken an unofficial leave of absence as of this month. I only just got the job. So I am technically in my third year, but probably starting my official third year next year once I finish this traineeship. I did my MSc in sports psychology at the University of the West of England. So I was there for 2 years down in Bristol. And I did my BA in psychology at the University of Limerick, where I'm currently studying, which is down in Limerick in southwest of Ireland. Not many people have heard of it. So that's kind of one of the hats, as you can see, that I wear. But as Caroline introduced, I do have a second hat, and I kind of feel I'm sitting here very much in between the two, because I am an athlete as well. I competed at the London 2012 Games on the 4x400 metre relay. I missed out on qualifying for my individual event of the 400 hurdles by 0.4 of a second, so that was heartbreaking in itself. I was a European finalist, World University Games finalist in 2013, and I hold the Irish Under-23 record, second on the Irish all-time list. So some achievements there. I don't have any gold medals to show you, I'm afraid. If I was a gold medalist in Ireland, I would be a superstar, so definitely not a superstar. I kind of come to this with a kind of a unique perspective that what I'm researching, I can fully back up on my own experience of being an athlete and having trained in a lot of high performance environments. When I was doing my MSc in sports psychology at the University of the West of England, the original reason I actually went to that university was because of my training. It was the degree fit in very much around my training. I was training in Bath University under Malcolm Arnold, one of the most esteemed hurdles coaches in the country. And to get an opportunity like that, you don't pass up. But unfortunately, in Irish sport, being a full-time athlete is almost unheard of, especially in the Olympic sports. So you have a lot of student athletes. I've been a student athlete as long as I can remember. So my identity has always been the student athlete, athlete first, student second. But at the moment, that's kind of in a grey area. So I just saw this quote. Dr. Thelma Dye Holmes, she works in New York in one of the oldest mental health institutes, and they had a meeting recently-ish, back in 2013 or 2012. It was a group of athletes, an athletes commission, and mental health researchers, people who work in mental health organisations met up, and this was a quote that came from that meeting, that it was all about athletes and mental health. So they were talking about this in America long before we were. That mental health is a stigma that is tied into weakness and is absolutely the antithesis of what athletes want to portray. And this is kind of exactly what sparked my interest. Now, when I first got into the idea of into sports psychology, I started my idea of wanting to be a sports psychologist back when I was in school. I thought, I like psychology. I do sport, they make sense to marry the two together. And I was always going to be a performance psychologist. That was the way I was going to go. And I'm lucky that I am working in that setting at the moment. But what sparked my interest in this area of mental health was when I was training in Bath in the UK, and when I was trying to decide on my thesis topic, and I had done an essay for my clinical therapies module on depression in sport, and it really shocked me because before that I was one of those people who thought, we're athletes, and I was riding the crest of a wave. I had a really amazing breakthrough year in 2011. I'd just been to the Olympics in 2012, and I had a good year in 2013. And I thought, why could athletes really, why is depression so common in athletes? And it was only when I was doing my research, because at that time there wasn't the people coming forward on Twitter. That was only 5 years ago, but there really wasn't that many people coming forward, and I couldn't really understand why athletes would be affected. I still had the idea, as one myself, I still had the idea because I didn't really have that experience of the negative side of sport yet. And when I was training with one of my close friends and training partners, and the group was diagnosed with depression in 2014 and took a year's break from training just to get himself right. And it was only then I realised, okay, this really is a real issue. Not only have I studied this has happened to someone I know, and someone who I actually thought was hiding it really well, because I was completely oblivious. I saw him for 3 hours every day and had no idea. But then I realised I don't see him for those other 21 hours in the day. I don't know what he does. And to be honest, it turned out it was very, very little. Other than training, he had nothing else going on. So this is what sparked my interest. And ever since then, I've really wanted to marry my interest in performance and sports psychology with this idea that athlete well-being needs to be supported. So I'm in a kind of a blessed position in the Sports Institute that I have a little small bit of influence, but I'm nudging my way in further. So in terms of the barriers towards help seeking among athletes, unfortunately there's not a huge amount of research in this. And the research I'm taking this from is from 2012. Amelia Gulliver in Australia did research on this, just a qualitative study with about 15 elite young athletes to understand what do they see as the barriers to help seeking, to seeking help for mental health issues as an athlete. And what she came up with was, as you can see, by far and away, the biggest barrier was stigma. And you can see other areas: not accessible, lack of time, denial of the problem, lack of awareness. That touches on this idea of mental health literacy, which I'll talk about. But stigma is by far and away the biggest barrier, and it continues to be. And I'll show you some of the research that I've gotten just from the preliminary analysis from my study will show that that is definitely what's the case. So to go back to my MSc, I ended up doing my MSc on a qualitative study. I interviewed 6 elite male athletes, and I wanted to do it on elite athletes, but unfortunately there was no female athletes who had publicly come forward at the time that I could find in Ireland anyway, and there's still very few in Ireland that had come forward to say that they'd suffered with a mental health issue. It was a very male problem, which definitely points to their stigma. Why is it only men coming forward? Why at the time were no women, especially in Ireland, coming forward to say, I have suffered? And the assumption was that women just go and seek help, men don't, and then it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger that they have to go out and talk about their struggles to then make it okay for other men. Whereas women, it's just assumed they go and seek help. That isn't obviously the case, but that was the assumption at the time. So I did my research, and I interviewed 6 male athletes, and this is exactly what was coming up again and again, without asking them directly about the barriers. All of them said why they didn't. One person I was talking to, he had been a rugby player back in the 80s, 20 years it took for him to come out to talk about how he had been depressed and to seek help. So they all talked about the stigma. It's not male, it's not masculine, it's seen as weak. So all of that pointed to stigma. So it was kind of a given when I was looking at PhD topics that this is what I wanted to get involved with. So where does this stigma come from? Why is this? And it doesn't take you very long to go onto Google, type in a few inspirational messages for an athlete, and these are the kind of things that come up. Do you want it more than you can breathe? Are you weak if you don't try? And are you giving it 110%? And if you don't, are you weak? Weakness is a choice. Pain is weakness leaving the body. The weak get eaten. Again and again, weak is bad, weak is bad. And physical weakness is bad, obviously. If you're not physically strong, you're not going to be as good as your competitors. And unfortunately, that idea translates into mental health. If you have a mental health issue, you're seen as weak, and weak is not what sport is. You're always trying to train, trying to work hard to eliminate weaknesses, and unfortunately, having an anxiety attack or being depressed or just feeling a little bit low, you're seen as weak and you can't go perform at your best. And as an athlete, while I had some really good successes up until 2013, I got to the Olympics in 2012, and when I got there and I just missed out by that 0.4 of a second, I assumed going to Rio, it was going to be an easy task. I was going to get to Rio, 0.4 of a second, that's 0.1 of a second each year. I'm going to do that with ease. Oh my God, the way I had improved the year before, I was going to be in the final, the way I was thinking in 2012. And unfortunately, I saw the other side to sport that I hadn't seen up until then. I got struck with my first injury in 2014, and pretty much every year since then, I've been sidelined from seasons because of injury. And I didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about how injury really made me feel until recently. And it's only now that I've been able to step back, and Rio has ended. And unfortunately, I had the task of watching my brother miss out on a medal in Rio in the 400-meter hurdles, my training partner, my brother, by 0.1 of a second. So not only was I not there because I was injured, I had someone nearly come home with a medal, so that was tough. And I didn't ever talk about it, even though my boyfriend had to listen to me crying. I didn't talk about it outside of that because I did see if I allow this to set in, it's going to make me weaker. This was exactly how I felt. Even though I had started studying it, I still saw that my athlete self was holding on to, I can't let go. And after Rio, I had done an interview, and it was based on work I was doing with Sky Sports at the time. And the interview turned into my injury, and I talked about it for about an hour, and it was very therapeutic, and it was great. And it had been stuff I talked about openly at that stage. But the interview went live, and it got huge traction online and in the papers, and I got so many messages telling me how brave I was and how brave you are, and oh my God, this is so amazing, you're so honest, you're so brave. And you know what Helen spoke about today is just life. It's just fact, it's what happened to her. And it was the same as me. You know, there was days where I did cry and cry and cry. And it was, you know, it was an awful time, but I didn't show that beyond there. And people saw that as brave, and that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be that we talk about mental health issues as brave. It should be, you don't come out and say, I broke my ankle, or I tore my hamstring, and people go, oh, you're so brave for telling me that, thank you so much. But talk about a mental health issue, and even just telling someone that you're struggling is seen as really brave, and that's really wrong. I don't think that should be the case. So to move on from that, just a little background to mental health in athletes. So I had wanted to go down this route, but I realised it's not enough to just study what is the state of the art in terms of mental health around in athletes if we don't understand what their attitudes are towards mental health, because a lot of how we measure mental health issues in athletes are self-report, either through clinical interview where someone is telling you how they feel, or in a piece of paper and they tick off how they feel. Now, if someone doesn't want to tell you how they feel, they're not going to tell you. It's very easy not to. So 46% of athletes who were interviewed in a study by that same researcher, Amelia Gulliver, down in Australia, she interviewed a huge number of athletes from the Australian Institute of Sport, and she found that at the time when they did this survey, nearly half of them were experiencing symptoms, now not a clinical level, but symptoms of a mental health issue. In a study by Wallen et al. In 2016, so very recently, nearly a quarter of the NCAA athletes presented clinically relevant symptoms of depression. And then finally, injured athletes are at always a higher risk of developing depression than non-injured athletes. And that's shown again and again. Injury does predispose you to the symptoms of depression. So that's just I've just taken really, really small parts, but if you just look at the mental health research, this is what comes up again and again. Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of it, and some of it can be quite mixed. Some will say that athletes are less likely to be, or student athletes are less likely to present with depression because they're buffered by being students and having other things going on. But again, there's issues around self-report, and most of those studies come from male collegiate athletes. So again, is stigma actually giving us what the true values of those are? So why are these numbers so high? I mean, 23%, when you see 46%, 23% doesn't seem that high, but that's a quarter of the athletes that were studied. Not even just a quarter of athletes overall, just in that small study. There's different reasons why athletes suffer from mental health issues. So this is just from that Wallen study, that's just the NCAA figures. There's a huge number, and I could list them all. I've experienced them, I've seen them, I've studied them. The inherent pressures that come with being an athlete, with performing, with making fitness, making teams, all of those kind of things. That athletic identity that Helen alluded to. Athletic identity is very, very important for an athlete because it's what motivates you to work harder and to push yourself for training and to give 110% and not leave stones unturned. when everything is going well. But if you're injured or if you are forced into an early retirement and your whole sole identity is tied up with being an athlete, and that suddenly that identity is taken away, that rug is pulled out from under you, what's left? So you can see how an athlete would struggle with that. Injury, it's a given, I've experienced a lot of it. Career transitions, whether it be from junior to senior, or it can be transitioning out of sport, or maybe for some athletes transitioning to a different sport. Performance issues, maybe your performance is just not going well, you're having hit a bit of a plateau where you've improved, and actually your performance is not happening at the moment. The general athlete lifestyle, you could hear how regimented it is from Helen. And environmental stressors, be that the training environment, the coach, funding, all of those kind of things. So there's a huge range of stressors that athletes are faced with that can affect their mental health if the help isn't there. So to go back to what my main topic is of stigma, what is stigma? So stigma is a social devaluation of a person or a group on the basis of some characteristic. Now that's a very old quote from Goffman back in 1963. Stigma originally came about, the idea of what stigma was back in the ancient Greeks' times. So if someone had done something wrong, had, stolen something or committed adultery, whatever it was, a physical mark was put on them. And that was called the stigma. So it was to show that they had done something wrong, there's something wrong with them, they are flawed, they're a bad person, and you have a mark to show that. And that name has been carried with us and now sits with mental health. So instead of having a physical marker to say there's something wrong with you, someone tells you they have depression or they're taking medication or they go to see a counsellor, that's their now modern day version of a stigma. So that's really scary. There's 3 forms of stigma. So there's public social stigma, so the stigma that we as a general public have towards a different group, so people with mental health issues. We have, and that kind of social stigma comes from stereotypes around outgroups. So maybe in America at the moment, people with mental health are dangerous, and they're the ones who are shooting up our schools. People with mental health, that group over there, we're scared of them. And then a self-stigma is that stigma, that public stigma internalized by that person. So they read these papers, they see these news articles. President Trump is again blaming people with mental health issues for all of this violence in our country. That must make me a bad person. I must be violent. I must be bad. So it's that internalization of that public stigma. And finally, the third type of stigma is labeling. And that's probably the most effective, and it's probably the one that has the most maladaptive consequences for the athletes, because that's the type of labels like weak, not good enough, you should, being called weak as an athlete is probably the worst label that could come with it. So labeling is just putting that irregularious label on a person associated with whatever the group that they have been identified with. So I just found this mental health charter for sport and recreation. Unfortunately in Ireland we do not have something like this, so hopefully maybe my little bit of influence at the Sports Institute can help something like this. But stigma is mentioned here in the third of their aims to achieve. So to promote well-being, to increase knowledge around mental health, to reduce stigma always has to come with that. But is our stigma actually being reduced just by saying we are going to reduce it? And if we're going to reduce it, how are we going to reduce it? So to give you an outline of my sample, luckily, because of my standing as an athlete, I originally proposed this as having 500 participants, and it just completely exploded when I put it on Twitter, and I got 5 times as many. So 2,500 people filled in my survey. So analysis is ongoing, and it's going to take me a while. So pretty evenly split between males and females. I've got just under 1,400 athletes. I also interviewed sports professionals and staff, physios, coaches, sports psychologists, all those people involved working with said athletes, and just a group of non-athletes of about 500 to serve as kind of like a comparison group. So in terms of the demographics, 790 from individual sports, so unfortunately a huge number of them come from athletics, so a little bit skewed because of my own background. And then team sports, soccer, Gaelic games in Ireland, so hurling and football. We have a few from hockey. Our hockey teams didn't really come forward to help out with this one too much. And rugby. And in terms of the competitive, which is really going to be powerful for when I'm hoping to publish a few papers from this, I have a huge elite sample. I considered elite or international. I called it elite/international because in Ireland, to reach the elite level in a Gaelic game sport is to play for your county or your city. You can't compete at an international level, but if they compete at a county level, so that's the highest you can get in their sport, I consider them elite. And then I have 38 Olympic or Paralympic athletes. They've come from Rio or London, because I kind of pestered the people I know. So yeah, really big sample. So definitely some interesting findings come from that. Some of the measures the 5 measures I used, I based this, nothing like this has been done in a sports sample before, hasn't been measured, they haven't measured stigma, and definitely very little has been done in this area in an Irish sample. So I wanted to understand the athletic identity, so I kind of put it into 2 pools. So there was athletes filled out the first 2, and then everybody filled out the full 5. So this was based on research that was done into stigma and to attitudes towards mental health among counselling students, among nurses, among doctors. So people who are working in the area, but nothing had been done in the sports context. So what I'm going to do is just run through kind of some key figures from each of those scales, just to give you an idea of what way it's going. So the athletic identity measurement scale is to measure that athletic identity. So there's 10 items on it, and I've just highlighted 3 that I thought were really, really important. So one of the items, I need to participate in sport to feel good about myself. So say that's 100% of the people. 78% of the athletes said, I need to participate in sport to feel good about myself. At least 78% of them agreed or strongly agreed. Sport is the only important thing in my life. So thankfully, we only had 10% of people agree with that. So people weren't willing to say it's the only important thing, but again, self-report, it's very easy to see an athlete to see this is a negative thing. I don't want someone to think it's negative. Now, if I would be very depressed, if I were injured and cannot compete in my sport, I haven't changed a word in that item, but this is exactly how it was worded. 76% of the athletes agreed or strongly agreed. And that's worrying, because I hadn't changed that. Very depressed was in that item, and people still agreed that if I was to be injured and couldn't compete, I would be very depressed. So huge red flag here, but what's being done about it, especially in an Irish context? I can tell you as a sports psychologist, there's not a huge amount at the moment. So this question was taken directly from a government study that was done with these GAA athletes. It was a nationwide study that was conducted, so I kind of took it out, changed it a bit, and made it my own. So I asked the athletes to identify who would they feel most comfortable outside of their significant other or their close family and friends. In their sports context, who would they be most comfortable approaching with an emotional or psychological problem? And the results showed that over half, or nearly half, would go to a teammate first, which makes sense. They're probably their friends, the people who they'd be closest to. Now, if these teammates have a stigma towards mental health, where are they going to be? How are they going to be received? You know, you have to be very, very careful. If half of these people are going to their teammates and their teammate goes, depression, ooh, whoa, I don't know what to do with that. There's something wrong with you, or you're weak. Straight away then, how is that going to be dealt with? A measly 10% would go to their sports psychologist. And that's not because only 10% agree with working with sports psychologists. Unfortunately, there's a lot of athletes who just simply don't have access. So that's probably representative of the amount of people who have actually access to a sports psychologist. 7%, scarily enough, of 7% of nearly 1,400 people said that they wouldn't want to talk to anyone in their sports context. Now, hopefully those people are going to someone, be it a significant other or a friend. But this just definitely has significant impact in terms of who are we educating. And really we need to educate everybody about mental health and mental health literacy, and educating people better, because people are going all around. Only 4% are going to their doctor. We're probably one of the most, are probably the only educated person here in terms of mental health issues. In terms of those people, as I said, 22% would go to their coach. There's been lots of research to show that there's a significant link between coaches' support and athlete mental well-being. So if a coach is supportive, especially through injury or difficult times, athlete's well-being is better. But what if that coach, again, has a stigma towards mental health issues, or don't really agree with it, or don't really get it? What happens to that athlete then? So just an important consideration here. So in terms of the attitudes towards sports psychology, and a gentleman there asked the question about athletes are open to performance psychology, and that was what was found here. Athletes, in terms of the athlete's knowledge of the sports psychologist's role, 87% of them recognise, so these are the numbers here, 87% recognise that, yeah, I go to a sports psychologist to fine-tune my performance. That's great, that's what we want. 81%, yeah, resilience, that's the buzzword, that's what psychologists do, help me cope with pressure. Only 50% said that they would help me if I was upset. Now, for the few athletes who do have a sports psychologist and the few athletes who don't, who are they going to? We saw on the previous page that it's quite mixed. So that's in terms of one aspect of the sports psychologist role in terms of performance side. But when it comes to the attitudes towards sports psychology for well-being, results weren't so positive. So 18% wouldn't want other athletes to know they saw a sports psychologist. 13% wouldn't want anyone to know they saw a sports psychologist. And again, the numbers, 182 athletes wouldn't want anyone to know they see a sports psychologist. Now, there's not a huge amount of stigma around sports psychologists. If 18% of these people don't even want them to know I'm seeing this person, who's to say they're ever going to go and seek mental health and better mental health support? So in terms of, this was from the full study, from the full 2,500 people. The stigma scale for receiving help, so there was some real worrying, there was some really interesting results here, and the one I'd allude to the most importantly is over 1,500 people said that seeing a professional for a psychological problem carries a social stigma. So if ever there was highlighting that there's a barrier towards mental health, that's it there. I have just 2 more slides and then I'm done. So as you can see, in terms of receiving help, even 140 people saw it as a weakness. So again, stigma is still there. In terms of attitudes towards seeking professional help, attitudes are better. So people, in terms of self-stigma, aren't carrying so much of a self-stigma. People have quite positive attitudes towards the idea of seeking help. But they see this public stigma as still as a huge barrier, that's 63%, so which is really really helpful to know. So in terms of future directions, where I'm going to go forward with this, I'm going to look at gender differences across sport, and whether sport participation has an effect on attitudes specifically, and follow up on some qualitative research, just to get some real words from these people. In terms of reducing stigma, my idea would be to be proactive, not reactive. So it's not good enough just to react when there's a mental health issue. We need to educate people before it ever comes to that. We don't try to jump in when someone is already sick. We try physically sick. We try to look after our body, nourish our body to be healthy. We should be doing the same to our mind. And there's multidisciplinary education that we can consider. So I have been told to finish. I'm going to finish up. So I don't know if I have any questions, but thank you all very much for listening. I need to see you.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes before we stop for break. So does anyone have any questions for Jessie? Okay, we've got one at the second row here. Oh, sorry. We'll do this one first then, sorry.
Jessie, do you think the numbers about approximately, I can't remember the exact numbers, but 1 in 10 would either go to see a sports psych or a doctor if they were very depressed? When they actually get depressed, do you reckon that number goes up or down?
Sorry, well, I don't really...
So if that is a group of well athletes,
I understand,
when they actually get depressed...
Do you think the number would increase?
Could that potentially, do you think that goes up and down or stays the same?
I would hope so. I would hope at least that people are seeking help and that there is some, but it's hard to know, obviously, are people seeking help. I think now there is a lot more awareness among the multidisciplinary teams that as physio will recommend. I just think you might want to go and see this doctor here today and just figure something out, which may not have been the case a few years ago. So I would hope that the number would definitely be significantly higher than 1 in 10, but again, it is difficult to know.
Okay, just one more question at the second row here. And we have got a break, so if anyone does have any questions, doesn't have a chance to ask Jessie, we'll be
I'll be around.
Quite happy to.
Hi, Jessie. Quick question. On the slide, you said you had some Paralympians involved, and I just
Yes.
wanted to ask if you had disabled athletes through the entire ranks or just at that level, and then if you've been able to identify any differences in their attitudes towards stigma.
I haven't done anything to single out disability athletes or Paralympians, so any answer that they fell specifically under the athlete category, but it would be a really interesting consideration for parasport. Parasport in Ireland is definitely one of our strongest, the same as in GB, where we've gotten quite strong at it. So it will be interesting. It will be taking it in a very different direction in terms of the stigma that they're seeing, though. That's probably the only the only thing I would see, but definitely for future, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Jessie.
you.
We're going to have to leave it there, and
Yeah,
I'm sure
no
there
worries.
are lots of other questions.